Everything that we do, from our customer evaluations to the technology that we build to the roadmaps that we have, everything converges with one thing in mind, and that's to serve you, the customer.
Sharewell provides enterprise power without the cost and complexity.
I've got a system that I can customize with little training.
Never have to write a line of code and never need a developer level resource to touch the tool.
Having this portal and being able to integrate it with our existing SharePoint sites and being able to provide on-demand reports and searches.
Anything that you can conceive of that you need to automate and integrate, you can build.
Within days of receiving the product, it was plugged into our virtual environment.
It's a game changer.
Most of our competition, you'll find out, is built on old legacy technology.
We can get you up and running as quickly as possible, and yet you'll never outgrow us.
Our software and our technology was built on the latest, most innovative technology available today.
Whether you have it on-premise and bring it into our hosted environment, or take it from our hosted environment and bring it on-premise, it doesn't matter.
It's about people at Sharewell. It's in the relationships that we build.
At the end of the meeting, he turned to me and he says, "You guys have got the deal." And I said, "Well, why? What made the difference?" And he says, "It's the way Sharewell treated us."
We don't get it right every time. We listened, we identified the problem, and then we worked through the solution together.
You need to be worried about your legacy. Your legacy is based upon the tools and the people that you employ and how cost effective and what the quality is. So keeping this simple and not expensive and easy to maintain saves you a lot.
Hello, my name is Mark Fay from Sharewell Software. We're a proud sponsor of TFT 2014, bringing great ITSM content to the world. Please enjoy this next presentation.
Okay, hi, my name is Sean McClean. Be giving a presentation called Crushing the Compass, Learning in the World Without Direction. I want to take a moment and thank everybody for participating in this and also for voting me and giving me the chance to share ideas. My background is in technical training in ITSM, both as a trainer and an implementer of ITSM tools, and an idle consultant in a variety of different contexts and architect. I've got several different things to talk about and a fairly decent amount of time to do that, but I find things most interesting to me if I get the chance to share ideas and have your ideas as well. To me, these are ideas that are very much a work in progress, and I want to join you, the community, to keep a part of that work in progress and to help develop these ideas. My ideas, of course, tend to resolve around training and teaching. And because I think training and teaching is critical in our world today. So without further ado, then what I'm going to do is try to shift to the slides. I hope you'll bear with me as I kind of navigate the environment here. And that'll take me just a moment because as I shift over, we'll see how this breaks out. Hopefully in just a moment, you'll see some slides. There we go. And there they are resolving, so I think that's a good thing. As I said, my topic is crushing the compass. What I wanted to do is talk about education and training and learning in a world without directions. I think really, as I said, training is super important in the world today, whether we're looking at ITSM or technology or pretty much any field. It's becoming very much a more and more critical thing. But what I want to do is kind of take an idea that's been developing in my head and walk through it a little bit farther. So I'll be talking about how learning has always in the past done everything from semantically to tool-drivenly, focused on kind of the same methods that we handled trade. If you go back and you think about the ancient trade routes, you know, when we talk about triangular trade routes for the shipping industry, or you talk about the Silk Road, these are paths that people went down, and they used navigational tools to help them and kind of march down that. So I'm going to kind of talk about how training works in very much the same way, education and training. And then what I want to do is talk about how technology is shifting those tools that we use to help us navigate and kind of stripping some of those navigational compass points that we're used to give us something else. And as I talk about that, it also comes out to the idea that our business and culture, global business and economy, and global culture and global technology are all driving to help kind of strip away that ability for us to use those same navigational elements that we're so used to. And so, of course, then I'm going to need to talk a little bit about where that takes us and where we're going, and what learners and teachers alike should probably be thinking more about. And so we'll talk about maybe what skills we need, and some of the things that are emerging today is maybe new tools that we can use to navigate kind of a brave new world. And instead of following the same specific route that we always did as traders in the knowledge and learning economy, to maybe move more into the idea of pioneers and explorers, and what kind of tool sets we might need as learners and teachers in that world. Now, if I'm going to talk about any of this, I have to kind of refer back a little bit. And I would tell you, I was fortunate enough to get to do a talk for TFT14. And if you want, you're more than welcome to look that up. It's I entitled it Rock, Paper, Scissors, Lizard, Who? Because I was playing on a game that was probably a game most of you know about, rock, paper, scissors. But what I was pointing out was that disruption in certain fields kind of shakes things up. And what I talked about then was the idea that there are two areas or two authors that have been really foundational to my thinking in this area. Specifically, the one that probably gets me most thinking about this is the Medici Effect, a book by a gentleman by the name of Johansson. And what he had pointed out is kind of what I have diagrammed here, was that in most areas, in most disciplines, we move from the foundational level, the base of the mountain, so to speak, and we climb that discipline all the way to the top. We follow a pretty fixed path to get there. You have to learn the basics before you get to the intermediate, and then you have to learn the advanced to get to the, and then if you want to become expert in a different discipline, you have to climb that mountain as well, starting at the bottom. And what I was saying in the rock, paper, scissors, lizard, who conversation was that that was kind of an old way of doing things, and we used certification and diplomas and degrees as markers for our progress up that mountain. And I was kind of asking the question, in education, which has been working pretty much the same since Socrates was doing it, we might need to shake things up. We might need some disruptors to our game of rock, paper, scissors. So that to me would be some lizard Spock, if you will. So I needed something to shake that mountain climbing methodology up. Now what Johansson said was the trick there was to jump between disciplines instead of climbing all the way up to the top. And I left that as kind of an open question of where are we going? And I got a lot of feedback for it, so I certainly appreciate that. And some of the feedback was, well, where are we going? And so that's kind of what I thought it would be good to take a look at. And so in that case, going beyond the lizard Spock and the disruption that happens between different disciplines, as we're no longer following a path up the same mountain anymore, but jumping in between them, I want to take a deeper look into learning and training and where it is. So in terms of learning, I thought I'd bring this guy up because I'm not sure if any of you recognize that little logo there, but a certain browser that used to be very recognized and used and pretty familiar with. And that one is such a great icon for me because it follows that exact model or that analogy that I was making, that we're really kind of sailors on a sea of trade, following a set path. And in the navigator days, and I mean that all pun intended, I guess, but in the navigator days, the goal, if you're following an established trade route, whether you're following it by a ship or a road or any of those areas, the idea is that you're gaining advantage and profit by following the same path that others have followed. And really, all the navigational tools that you think of in that analogy, the sextant and the compass and all of those tools that we would use, were there to keep us on course so that we could make the best of our possible, the most efficient trip for our trade. And education and learning kind of has followed that same model. We created a course or a pathway, and we all wanted to follow that. Now, what are some of the things that worked as our compass or our navigational tools in learning? Well, even our semantics kind of helped spell that out. You know, you have a teacher at the top and then students down at the bottom. You can go to the head of the class if you're good. So again, the front. You know, so courses had tops and bottoms. Books have beginnings and ends. For that matter, a class has a beginning and an end. You would matriculate or graduate. You would end your study. So there's all these directions involved in learning, even semantically speaking. We think about learning and training in the world as something that, you know, is a course that we follow, just like a trader bringing goods from a point to another point, and you profit when you reach the end of your journey. So semantically speaking, everything's about having those navigational tools. Now in course design, the major one that we would use is the objective, right? You create a learning or training objective, and it's very specific. And when you write it correctly, you know, at the end of this session, you should be able to what? Well, we should be able to test on that and create quantifiable, verifiable ways to prove that you can do this thing in this way under that circumstance. Well, that's what got us our certificates and degrees. So a lot of learning was about those types of navigational tools that help us to be very specific and to follow that path, just like the traders did on the trade routes. Again, shipping or walking along the Silk Road, it's the same idea. So there was a path in the previous slide to a peak. If I were climbing a mountain, there's a set path that I would take to the peak of that mountain. But how do we get to those spaces in between? Does that skill set of using those compasses or navigational tools let us do anything other than better follow a direct path to the same end? Well, that's kind of where I want to bring things to next. So what are some of the things that are shaking up our compass and our sextant and our steering guide and all our maps and everything that we're used to follow that path to education? Well, there are a lot of things that are out there. And to me, one at the top of the pieces is technology. And technology as a whole is doing a lot of things for us, but it's also removing some of those directions that we're so used to. And one of the areas that I wanted to talk to you about this is recordings and blogs and podcasts and recordings of podcasts. All of those pieces are beginning to strip one direction that we always counted on in a course. They're starting to strip the beginning and end. And certainly a recording has a beginning and an end. But in the old days, and by old days I mean, you know, a couple of years ago, when you would go to a site and arrive at that site, then you would leave, you would start, and if you didn't make the class, then you would miss all of the knowledge. Just like actually in the trade routes, if you didn't leave on the ship at a certain time of year, you would miss the winds or the waves and the things that you needed to get there. So it was very time intensive. In the end and the beginning were very specific points. But with recordings now, it doesn't matter if I don't show up on time. I can see the recording. Well, it matters if I show up on time to deliver the talk, but it doesn't matter as much if you don't show up on time to hear it, because you can now come back and listen. Not only that, but the organization of a course is not as relevant. I don't have to listen to lectures 1, 2, 3, and 4. I can listen to lecture 1 and skip 2 because it's about content that I already know, and jump right to lecture 3 because it's a recording. I can play it. And you know, I can go from 1 to 3 and listen to 4 and realize, oh my gosh, at 4, I wish I'd known this thing at 1. Let me go back and listen to that again. So that straight direction that we would follow of a traditional course from a beginning to an end kind of has started to morph out for us, and it's made it a lot less critical that we follow a specific order. Now, another element that's a technological one that matters along these same lines, it helps strip that idea of tops and bottoms and beginnings and ends and all those navigational components that we're so used to in education and training, is the advance of collaborative tools. And by this, I mean, whether you're using Office 365 or whether you're using Google Docs or anything else, many of the tools today, we edit documents collaboratively and synchronously. We used to take a draft of a document and we would pass that draft from person to person to person. Whether it was on paper or later on computer, we would still pass the draft and you would version the draft, right? Today, technologies are becoming so advanced that we can actually all collaborate on a document or an item or an object at the same time. We can both be editing the same document, or 5 of us can be editing the same document. So instead of following the path to the end of the piece that we're trying to develop, I can move from step to step to step. Kind of interesting. Again, stripping away that direction from what we're used to for education. Now, when I'm talking about those types of collaborative tools, that's just one of them. But another type of collaborative tool that you see more and more in virtual classes, and we'll see here as well, are posting boards. Posting boards that allow people to ask questions, whether I put it or Twitter. Those types of collaborative areas allow me to ask questions, but they strip the top and the bottom from education. In a classroom environment, in a physical classroom, we're very used to the teacher stands at the front. There's very clear demarcation between the teacher and the students, and those pieces are very clearly outlined. But in today's collaborative and virtual environment with posting boards, the answers may not be provided by the teacher. They may be provided by other students. If you've ever participated in any of the massively open online courses, or MOOCs, you would find that there are hundreds and thousands of participants now. And in those classes, oftentimes it's the other students that provide valuable information, even more sometimes than the instructor. Likewise, sometimes the instructors for some of these sessions are looking to the students to gain new and fresh ideas. So the sense of a top and bottom are kind of being stripped from us in the training and teaching classroom by these technologies. So the other element that I really want to talk about in terms of technologies that can be stripping some of the direction out of training and learning are search technologies. In the past, in that classic model again with that mountaintop we have to climb to the top of, in that classic methodology, we would go from the bottom to the top. If we wanted to know something advanced about cellular biology, we would need to learn the basics first, right? And if we wanted to get through the basics, then we'd have to get past the intermediates and go straight, slowly and meticulously to the top. But with search technologies and the advent of big data and the ability to throw questions out into the universe and just come back with an answer, I don't even have to climb the mountain. I can just peg the top and say, what's the answer to my question? Now, that can be a good thing or a bad thing. But in learning, it doesn't matter whether it's good or bad. It simply is. It's another element of technology that's kind of stripping the direction out of our learning. Rather than following the path that we might want to or possibly even should, we can just ask at the end. I keep thinking, I hate to do this. I'm a movie quote guy. I can't help it. So I keep thinking of The Princess Bride, that line where the guy goes, skip to the end, say man and wife. We can do that now. We can skip to the end and just get straight to the answer. Now, there's a great talk on this, and one of the things I try to do, to me, these ideas are for sharing and for us getting some compatible ideas on. And so I wanted to make sure I brought these out. There's a great TED talk out there on exactly this idea and how timing is being stripped out of our life, and we're living in what's called the digital now. But speaking of digital now, I want to talk about that now. The modern, the global, the technical economy and culture is all about fast. It's become exceedingly speedy, for lack of a better word. In fact, it's become so fast that those guides that we used to measure our course, the certificate, the diploma, the degree, they become almost obsolete or out of date by the time we need them. So it's almost like it's irrelevant by the time you go to show it to someone who would hire you on it. Now, I don't want you to just take my word for this. There's another post out there from a gentleman in the name of Reid Hoffman. He's actually the president of a university, and he wrote a fantastically interesting blog about disrupting the diploma. So here we have someone who is actually in charge of a university or college who is looking and going, I'm not so sure that degrees are going to work for us anymore, for exactly the reasons I'm talking about. And so what I'm saying is the speed of our economy and our culture and our technologies is moving at a point where those same navigational tools are not working for us that as well anymore. It'd be like trying to steer a jet plane with a traditional steering wheel. You can't figure out where to turn at Mach 3. Likewise, if we tried to put sails and a rudder on a jet plane, it wouldn't work any better than it would work if we tried to put maybe a sextant and a compass on a race car. Those navigational tools only work if you are moving at a pace that they're built for. The other element that I want to talk about in terms of culture is an idea that we need to move a little bit farther forward from where we are right now in terms of culturally and accepting things. In following that path that we would always traditionally go to from the bottom to the top of the mountain, so to speak, in learning one thing, you wanted to make as few stops along the way as possible. And we've got some great examples of this right now with the Olympics. If any of you have been watching any of the moving downhill quickly events, whether you're talking about downhill skiing or the bobsled or the luge or the skeleton, any of those areas, you can see those people running down as quickly as they can. They're looking to do the same thing we were talking about with our trade route. They're trying to pick the most efficient line, and they're using whatever tools possible to steer and navigate along that line as quickly as possible and not bang into the side of the course or go any farther out of the way than they have to. And that makes a lot of sense if you're in a trade mentality. We're trying to get from point A to point B. And if there's a few people doing that path, the more efficient you can make it, the more profitable you'll be. The quicker I can get from point A to B with the fewest amount of missed turns or turns that I go too wide in or places where I bump into things, the more efficient I can be. Now, that works great. And I think it works fantastically in an environment where, as in most of those trade examples, there's not that many people doing it. We have 2 trade caravans. Well, then when you come to my town with something unique, I'm probably going to want to buy it. And education, the same thing. When I come to you as a person that might hire me with a degree, and I'm only one of 3 people that have gone this route, I want to take the most efficient route to get there, because there are 3 to 20 other people. Then I want to get there with the least amount of work, so I can go to you, my hiring manager, and say, look, I have this degree. So having a course and a path that I follow, that's super helpful. But when does trade not work? And when does learning not work? Well, they stop working when everybody's doing it. If we had those trade routes, and instead of maybe 3 or 4 caravans coming through, millions of people were coming through with those same objects that they brought from that faraway place to me. If you came into my city and you were the 10 millionth person to show me the spice that you brought from some other place, or the little trinket that you brought from that other place, and you were the 10 millionth person, I wouldn't be that interested. And it's the same in learning. If you're moving to that most efficient path, and everybody's following that most efficient path, because everybody's following this idea that we need to follow the rules and go as straightforward as possible to get there quicker, it's suddenly not so interesting to me. It's nice that you have a degree. Guess what? So does everybody. It's nice that you have a certification. Guess what? So does everybody. In fact, now it's nice that you have those, but there's so many of them, I don't even know what it means. So as I go to hire you, I look and say the path that you've taken just tells me that, especially now, sometimes we're almost seeing some lashback in that idea that people who are showing certifications, that tells me that you're very efficient, but that maybe you've skipped some things along the way. You've made shortcuts to get to the path more quickly, and maybe you lack experience. So we're almost seeing this lashback where the trade route, the following the predetermined path, and the direction that everybody else followed, going in a very directed way, is maybe not as good as it used to be. Because now when I see that, I look and I ask, what mistakes did you make along the way? What did you learn? What experiences did you have? And this is where we're going to trying to start looking a little farther into this picture. So, and as I said, a great pointer to this is the Hoffman article on disrupting the diploma. Kind of talks a little bit about that. But where we're getting to now, and this is an area that I'll be spending more time blogging and writing on, is this idea that failure, which used to be not acceptable, if you're in a downhill mentality and trying to get, or a trade mentality, you're trying to be the first person there or the fastest person there. But now I kind of want to see some failure. I want to see some mistakes. In fact, in small doses, those failures can teach you more, so that what you bring to me is something different. It's no longer being the fastest person to the path. Now we're shifting from a Silk Road or a trade mentality to a frontier. And I'm kind of more interested in the pioneer in that kind of circumstance. So I hope by now I've got everybody at least along with me on the premise that it's education is starting to move away from the traditional navigational model that we had. We can't approach it the way that we would a trade route, where there are only so many people going to do it, and it's only available to so many under so many circumstances. Now we know with the globalization of technology and kind of the democratization of technology, everybody's doing it. And so now all of a sudden those trade routes are just, everybody's crowding down them. So we kind of need to change our mindset from someone who's going to follow a road to someone who's going to explore new frontiers. Because now it seems like that may be where the real new opportunities sit. And so now what I want to do in the second kind of portion of this talk is talk a little bit about those frontiers and what they may look like. What's it mean that we're going to go farther out? We're going to talk about competencies and values. And not necessarily completely replacing objectives, but a different navigational set that kind of matches this mindset that we're moving to. From maybe a tradesperson following a route to an explorer or a pioneer mapping out something completely new. I also want to talk a little more about the idea of mistakes and unlearning and what they're about. We'll talk a little about IEPs, and I'll mention what they are. And the other thing to me that's so critical, the biggest thing about learning, and I can't say this enough, and I just feel so strongly about it, I think we're educating people with the idea that the most important direction or navigational piece that we need to strip out of our vocabulary of learning and training, whether it's IT or college or anything, is finished. There's no such thing anymore in learning as finished. We need to continue pursuing new frontiers and moving on. So let's take a look at the mistakes part first. I have a dear colleague of mine, and she's a president of a small college, and has done a couple of presentations very recently about the concept of unlearning. And I think unlearning is great. This little screenshot comes from a great Google Plus group called Programming Geeks, and they have some great humor out there. But I think that this part is really critical. We used to kind of try to avoid failure. And in our Olympic mentality or our trades mentality, where we're going in one direction as quickly as possible, and there aren't that many other people traveling, then the most efficient route is the fastest. However, as we move into this new mentality, starting to talk about becoming explorers and pioneers rather than tradespeople following a route, we have to start moving into other areas and being willing to do failure, to actually, in some cases, seek failure. Not necessarily to seek huge failures, but to seek measured failures and then learn from those failures. I think failure is probably the best way to learn possible. And as I said, this is an area that I'm starting to explore more. So hopefully if I get to do another TFT talk, I can talk about that. But that's to me, that's the new interesting area, is turning around curriculum and learning towards failure. So maybe if we could actually start steering towards failure and unlearning, then we'd have a little more success at being frontiersmen and pioneers that would discover new things. And then maybe later we can talk about charting new paths. But in terms of that, and again, wherever possible, some references. If you're looking for a great reference out there, there's a fantastic TED Talk by Catherine Schultz. They have a couple of different cute nicknames for her. I think they call her the wrongographer, because she actually talks and studies and writes on using failure. And it's a great concept, but it's not one we teach people in school, and it's not one we're just beginning to. Many companies and cultures are starting to look at that idea. There's a CEO that I respect and admire pretty highly that is well known for saying, fail fast, find those mistakes and make them and get them out of the way and then learn from them. The other element there is unlearning. This idea that knowledge has an end assumes that when you reach the end, you would never need to go back. But that's not how the path goes. We learn new things, and then we have to be willing to unlearn things, and that's almost as much a skill that we've not been developing. So what do I mean about skills? Well, in objectives, the whole point was to measure something and state something and tie it into a box, almost like that downhill skiing modality again, right? The more narrow you could make that line, the fewer digressions you could make, the more specific you can make that line without banging into anything, the faster you'll go and the quicker you'll get to the bottom and the better a chance you'll win, right? Well, in contrast to an objective, we're starting to see a lot more focus on something called a competency. What's the difference between a competency and an objective? Well, a competency is more about skills and behaviors. What an objective is a specific task matched to a time in everything that you can nail down. And a competency, I might say, how do you cook? Well, or can you cook? Well, there are certain skills and behaviors associated with cooking, not cook me this one meal using these 4 ingredients, because that only tells me that I know how to cook this one meal using these 4 ingredients. But a competency instead is starting to measure a skill set. Now, competency isn't necessarily about getting from A to B, but it's having the tools to get anywhere. If I have the competency, I'm not worried about whether I go from A to B. I'm worried about I can go from A to Z or Q or anywhere I need to go. So competencies are a hugely useful tool. We're starting to see this now for people who are doing interviewing with HR organizations. You'll find that they may give you competency-based interviews. They're starting to ask more towards your skill set than can you, what tests have you passed? So that's going to become much more important as we move forward in education and training, and looking at the things that you're learning, pursuing education rather than looking at it towards passing a test, and more towards asking yourself, do I have the competency with this element? Rather than saying, I've completed an ITIL Foundations exam, it would be, am I competent with this specific area, specifically configuration? Am I competent with understanding how to implement configuration management? Those are the kinds of things that we're looking at with competencies. Now, competencies are harder to measure, and typically they start getting to the idea of rubrics. Now, a rubric is interesting as well, because usually when we think of objectives, you either have pass or fail, and you have scoring, and it's on a straight line, right? The higher the score, the better you are. When we start talking about a rubric, though, it starts to become multidimensional. Rubrics are interesting because you may score higher in some areas than others, and they kind of balance out to make one big picture. Value-based rubrics are also pretty interesting. We're talking about people having core values, and what's the rubric to measure those values. But measuring those will be much harder to do and much harder to explain. That said, it kind of leads us to another thing I think that we need to think about. In the area of new frontiers, instead of following the tradesman's route, we're now moving into learning and education like pioneers. As pioneers, we're going to start needing to not necessarily take a single path for graduation from college or high school for that matter. Instead, what we're going to see are individual learning plans. So the idea of an IEP is one that you develop yourself, or perhaps you have a learning coach teach you. But an IEP over a degree seems to me a much better picture. We've got a ton of different tools that are starting to lead towards this idea of no longer the traditional degree. MOOCs, of course, are massively open online courseware, are one of the major ones. And at one point, it's always been interesting to me. People look at MOOCs and they go, some people say they're successful. One of the people who developed one of the first MOOCs was recently started blogging about the idea that it didn't accomplish exactly what it intended. I won't say that MOOCs are the future or MOOCs are the answer, but they were certainly a disruptor that are changing the way we think about learning and education. And we have these massively open online courses that can be recorded and can be watched for credit or not credit, as the case may be. It's now more a matter of building your own path. I take MOOCs in every area from solar power to gaming. And I think adding those in all tie into a plan that I need to start designating for myself. And I think that's an important element to consider with regard to MOOCs. There are some other things out there that I think are just as interesting in that area that I really kind of want to make sure we touch on. There are some organizations that are also bypassing the traditional idea of a degree and touching upon that other thing that I said. A degree is doing classroom. Typically, we think of degrees in classic standard education and training as attending a class and doing as many things as you can as repeatably as possible to pass a repeatable task. And yet, when we get there, because everybody's done it, it doesn't show much for your experience. And that brings us to two of these other areas in here that I think are just fascinating. And I'm super excited that I'm going to be working with one of them to partner with the company that I work for. Organizations like Empower or Year Up are both organizations that are kind of bypassing the traditional degree idea and working with people that may be underprivileged or underserved in the education area to give them a much shorter area of education, but combined with experience. So instead of a 4-year degree, at which point it's questionable as to where you'll be at with that. There's a recent talk on NPR that was talking about something close to 60% of the people who are coming out with degrees. I don't remember the specifics, but the numbers are pretty staggering. And it takes time to get through the degree, and then it takes time to get hired after that. So instead, these organizations, Empower and Year Up, are starting to put together education and training plans by which they focus on getting a short piece of training that's very relevant to the business that they're looking for. And then the other great part is they're partnering with the business. So instead of following this one long path that was mapped out years and years before, they're working with the people at the end point, the people at point B in our trade route, us, the people that are hiring, to build a program or curriculum that's fast and turns those people into internships so that they can combine both the learning with the experience. So now they're getting past I'm not doing 2 years, I'm not doing 4 years or even 2 years. I'm doing 6 months of coursework in a way that the companies have said, I'll hire you if you're successful with this 6 months in an internship for another 6 months, which will give you then the experience. So now we're cutting out some times and giving opportunities to people that have never had them before. And that's fascinating. And that doesn't even begin to get us to areas like Code Academy or Udemy or other areas that are not the traditional college degree, but do offer learning and education. And if I look at all of these together, you start to realize it's an ongoing, never-ending process, but you're the person that maps it out. And if you're going to start mapping it out, that brings us to probably one of the last pieces that we need to talk about. If you're going to start mapping these pieces out, then you need some way to be another skill set of the pioneer would be, and I have to probably quote Mr. Dancy because I remember one of his titles being a digital cartographer. And it's a great analogy in this context because that's one of the things that made pioneers great. It's one thing to go explore and go rambling off into the bush and go taking different courses, but it's another entirely to be able to come back and talk about where you've been, to be able to come back and document. And so we need other tools to do that. And guess what? A piece of paper isn't doing that anymore. Going to a hiring manager and waving 3 degrees, 2 diplomas, and 19 certifications in front of a hiring manager's face isn't getting us hired. So we need to find other methods besides that to show the path that we've been. So in addition to having that willingness to fail, comes that skill of cartography and documentation. Now I threw 2 elements out there and there are a couple of others, but we're starting to talk now about the idea of a digital portfolio. Now for design people, some people use Behance or Carbon Made. There's one called Coder Bits for the more developing people. But essentially they're portfolios that show not just the tests you've passed, but your experience. And that's going to be, I think, a critical skill for learners in the new era. Not just to, number one, not to follow the path directed or be willing to step off that path, but number 2, to be able to map and describe what you did. To go to a hiring manager and say, yes, I took 19 different classes, that's great. But I want to understand how it all fits in to make you a hireable person. And that's going to be your responsibility. The explorers and pioneers that would come back, if they came back with a bunch of great stories, that's nice. But when did they really profit from it? They profited from it when they could show you a map that made sense. If they showed you a map with lots of little pieces and it showed point Z and point X and point M, but it didn't show you anything in between, that's not very useful. But when a pioneer or an explorer would go out and come back with a map that not only showed you point A and point Z and point X and point M, but all of the spaces in between and the mistakes made and the, ooh, don't do that because that's not much to get from that. Now we start to get a picture of a person that's got more going, and a person that might be one that I would want to collaborate with or work with or hire or any of those types of things. So that's a skill set that we're moving from. So this gets me to about time that I'll wrap this up and leave a little bit of time for questions. And so I just used a little tool out there that I'm kind of just become enamored of, which is bit strips. And I left a bit strip up there, but I put some takeaways on that bit strip. So you can kind of check and post it. But to me, the takeaways from this talk are IT or learning in any area is these days no longer about following a path. It's not about following the triangular trade route or the Silk Road to get from A to B and bring your unique trade goods from one place to another. Because why? There's millions of people doing it, almost billions. So walking down that path, you're not getting anything unique. So to me, we want to start looking at tackling your education and training like an explorer or a pioneer. So instead of following a route, you want to be willing to step off and make mistakes and unlearn and undo and mark those things down. And number two, you want to chart where you've been and where you're going. You need to make frequent maps and updates and be able to explain those. And then also be willing to backtrack if you make those mistakes and unlearn. And then last but not least, which kind of comes through in all of these, is to chart everything, to map out the path that you've taken and explain how you got there, or to warn other colleagues, or even to make a path that other people can follow. Because maybe in the path that you take for learning and the courses that you take, in mapping that and documenting it and sharing it, maybe your pioneer route will be the next Silk Road. It'll be the road that everyone else wants to go down. Okay, so if I did this right, in about a moment, I hope, close enough. So, assuming I did this right, we've shifted to my face. I'm wrapping up my talk, and I want to see if you have any questions. Now, I've got my question screen up, and I'm trying to read to see if there are any. And boy, I hope I'm looking at the right screen because I don't see anything. But one of the things that I will do is I'll be able to follow up with questions as we go. And if there are questions on this, I'm more than happy to follow up. I'd encourage you also to feel free to follow up with me with anything that you have. My contact information, I believe, is already all over the TFT website. I have another talk from TFT14 on rock, paper, scissors, lizard, who. And my information is out there as Sean P. McClean. So you can find me that way on Twitter. Or on any of the other areas or fronts or screens. And I think that leaves me with about 3 more minutes. And maybe if I have no questions, then maybe what I do is throw out some questions or thoughts for you, which is what areas do you think are critical in terms of studying and training? What areas and what are you doing? If you're a hiring manager, what are you looking for in a person in terms of training or teaching or education?
Recording has stopped. Recording has started.